if you don't mind introducing yourself to our
Sure.
audience.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, listeners. My name is Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. I'm an associate professor at Wellesley College. I teach in the Department of Africana Studies, and I wear a lot of hats. I'm a wife. I'm a mom of 3 kids. I also podcast. I'm the co-host on This Day in Esoteric Political History, and I'm the host of the new podcast, Operdemics, which is set to debut at the end of this month. And I do a lot of like public speaking, radio, TV, lectures, activism, writing, op-eds, you name it. I've been doing the gamut for the past few years now, and it's really meaningful and fulfilling work.
Wow, super excited. Like I read all the different hats. I was like, well, what doesn't she do? So
Sleep. She doesn't sleep.
Same. I know how it goes. Oh my gosh. So I'm just very excited, especially inside such a critical time inside of our history right now. It being Women's History Month too, and all of the parts of history that isn't addressed inside public education and even higher education, and just really get your 2 cents on like, you know, some things that you've seen have progressed throughout the years, things that still need to be inserted, and then things that are actually being battled today that people aren't hearing about. But before we do that, I had like a little warm-up game for us.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, I think that you would really like it. So we're going to do like a little bit of role play. So imagine yourself at a school board, and you have the power to insert different parts of history lessons inside of this school. And the board is asking you as professional, hey, so these are the events that we were thinking of, and we can only pick one of each scenario. And I have a list of these right here too.
Okay, great.
So I have, so say that the first board member, oh, you know, can we have either the Tulsa Massacre of 1921 or the Wilmington Coup of 1898? Which one would you think more foundational?
This is not even
I know it's not fair. It's not fair, but I thought it would be fun.
This is a setup. This is a setup. Oh man. Golly. Both are bad, but both are so critical to understanding American history. I'm gonna go with Tulsa. I think I would choose Tulsa.
And why?
That does not mean any like Wilmington is so equally important, but I'm choosing Tulsa because not only is it violent. I mean, they are literally dropping bombs on this Black town. But I think what's often left out of that narrative is that Black people are fighting back, and that even though they're not successful, to be able to see them shooting back, you know, and getting their veterans together, getting all of their pistols and trying to protect their community is often a part of the resistance that we just don't understand. And I wish we talked about that more. So I would include Tulsa because it just doesn't get talked about. And it's a horrific episode of white supremacist violence. But Black people never take anything lying down. And I think that's another moment where we can talk about how even in the midst of a massacre, Black people stood up for their lives.
Yeah, definitely. And there's been so many events that Black people have rebelled or really shown true power and true unity when it comes to, you know, facing against white supremacy or oppression or segregation, even during bondage and slavery, the different tactics that aren't mentioned. I feel like that needs to be inserted. But you never hear about it, not only through K through 12, but also in like higher education. You kind of have to look for it yourself. And it's just a shame, like all of the things that you find on your own, and you're like, why didn't I learn about this?
Why was this not in the textbooks? How is this not a part of something that we come back to every year? We should come back to Tulsa every year. We should come back to Wilmington every year. Because the effects, when I think of Wilmington, I mean, they don't get another Black elected official for another 100 years. It's not until the 1970s they get another Black elected official. like, because the trauma and the violence of that episode was so magnificent. I mean, it's just, how do you walk into someone's office and say, give up your seat or else, you know? But that's exactly what happens, you know? And it's also just tragic because they're not just robbing, you know, propertyless Black people. These are Black people with means. Not that Black people who don't have means are not significant. They are. But I think we should understand that these attacks are very strategic and that they're going after people whose assets they can steal and take. This is looting, you know, this is political looting and it's economic looting. And we don't talk about that.
At a much larger scale at that too. Like, people were, you know, flipping over the looting that happened over in Minneapolis. The riot and things like that, which I had like personal ties with that family over in Minnesota. They live in Apple Valley, and that Target that was like all over social media. Like, I just walked in that Target like last year. I was like, wait, that's the same Target that, you know, me and my cousins went to go get snacks at midnight, just being dumb. And now I see like the same carts and stuff that we got our chips from just completely destroyed, and things are on fire and things like that. And people were like, this is, you know, unspeakable. This is never heard of. I was all like, it's not unspeakable because it's happened before.
Yes. And you know what though? Target's gonna be all right. Target is gonna be all right. Can we get Philando Castile back? Can we get George Floyd back? Can we bring back these people's lives? No, we cannot. We can restock the shelves. You cannot restock families. Like, you know, I'm always like adamant about that because we always equate these like false equivalencies with people and property. And I'm like, people are not property. A dead person, a dead child is not the same thing as a damaged window or a cop car set on fire or whatever it is. But, you know, I think that's a reflection of living in a capitalist society. We value capital above all else.
Yeah, don't even get me started because my specialization is inside the prison industrial complex.
And how man. We can talk all day.
Yeah, we can talk all day. So I hope students who are behind bars earn an associate's degree behind bars.
Wow.
So I've seen all sorts of stuff and all the articles that I have to read up on, and I'm just all like, wait, like, you can't lease people to do your work. How are these big corporations and CEOs and things like that leasing people like property in order to run their companies for cheap labor? I'm like, wow.
It's gross.
This is modern day slavery.
Yeah, especially because I've taught in some prisons, and let me tell you, there's brilliance and talent and skill that is being untapped just because people want to exploit, you know, Black bodies and brown bodies and poor bodies. And it's, again, it's also something that's just unconscionable.
Right. Oops, before we go on another tangent, let me give you the next question.
Oh gosh. Oh yeah, we totally went down the rabbit hole. Next question. Yes.
Okay, so next two scenarios. So the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 or the Montgomery Bus Boycott of 1955.
Oh man. Again, not fair.
Yeah. None of them are fair, so spoiler.
While I typically lean on Black resistance through violence, I'm going to go with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Not because it was peaceful, because there were definitely people that were fighting back, and guns that were involved in the Black community was like, we are done with this. But I think it is a perfect example of what happens when Black people say, not only will we rob you of our presence on these buses and rob you of our dollar, but we will come up with a whole nother way to get around, to move, to have mobility outside of your transportation. And this boycott goes on for over a year. So by the time they get the victory, it's hollow. You know what I mean? I shouldn't say it's hollow, but like, think about this. If you had, you know, after 30 days, we say like, that's a habit. If for a whole new year, you had carpools, you had walk to work or walk to school, you lost 30 pounds walking to work, right? Like you made new friends carpooling or whatever it is. You created a whole new lifestyle to navigate around the bus system. When you finally get the victory to get on the bus, something else is being lost in replace of that in place of that seat, right? Whatever mode, whatever alternative you provided for yourself for that year is being lost. And I just think it's a complex way of looking at boycotts and looking at protest and looking at the key people of that movement, which was Black women, Black domestic workers were the head of that movement.
Thank you.
Joanne Robinson was out mimeographing like 40,000 handbills. This is like pre-FedEx, like Kinko's.
Right.
It was putting out flyers, keeping people off the bus. You know, King comes in and really becomes the face of it, but this was Black women at their best when it came to their activism and their refusal to be treated, you know, like they were un-American, you know, and they were unworthy of seats on a bus. How superficial and ludicrous is that? It's a powerful moment, but I think we've dwindled it down to like, you know, Rosa Parks and that's important too, but we got to talk about Claudette Colvin. We have to talk about the other women who were also thrown off the bus. You know, that was not the first time Rosa Parks was even thrown off the bus.
Right.
And there's just a much bigger story there that if listeners are interested, I highly recommend reading Joanne Robinson's book. So good.
Definitely. And I wanted to like even backtrack to Claudette when it came to like the reason why they didn't pick her to be like the representative because she was young and she was pregnant at the time, and like you know, we don't want, they had to be
you're not married,
right? So I was like, wow, even like internally there were like certain standards that weren't acceptable when it comes to winning this battle.
But how much more powerful would it have been if we had said a pregnant teenager is just as worthy as a seat on the bus, as a middle class, Rosa Parks wasn't even middle class, working class, respectable Black woman, right? Like that to me is even more powerful, standing up for those who are really marginalized. Yeah, it's a lot.
But I think it's just a testament of even some ideology that was ingrained inside of our own community, the Black community, and just things that were like, ooh, we can't say that, or felt like that we couldn't say that or show that just yet. Because we even felt like that it was wrong. And it took, you know, generation to generation to break those molds and actually say like, this would be a way more powerful statement. So that's just interesting, like the sort of like the onion and the layers inside of it too, of like different, like either oppression or hesitancy or misogyny or things like that, that really sort of held back not only Black individuals, but Black women, especially since I want to even say all the time, they were like the forefront of why things happen. So, and you don't even hear it.
You don't hear it. Even Rosa Parks was like, I would like to speak. And they're like, no, you've done enough.
Right.
And I'm like, you just muted Rosa Parks? Like, I mean, how is it that like, when it comes, I think, to the 20th century, people name King and Parks. Like, that's it. But we can quote King all day long.
Right.
We don't have quotes on quotes for Parks, right? No. We don't have like a catalog of her vocabulary, of her speeches, of her writings. And it's there, it exists, but like within the public memory, she's mute, she's silent. And I think that's a poor message to send about how we want our protests to look like, muted and silent and passive, because that's not at all who she was.
No, not at all. So we got a lot to touch on.
I know.
Right? Very exciting. Okay, so last question. Spoiler is not there. So, but it's not events, it's people. So either Joanne Robinson, so again, Montgomery Bus Boycott.
Yeah.
Or Ella Baker.
Oh man. Yeah. I'm gonna go with Ella Baker, but only because also like Joanne Robinson, I feel like she's underappreciated for her role in SNCC and the long freedom struggle and Freedom Summer and organizing students and really opting to say like, no, I don't, this is not going to be a group led by me. You are the leaders, right? And you will all have a stake in this movement. Ella Baker is amazing in her ability to say like, this is a collective struggle, we're going to do this together. We don't necessarily need a figurehead to like show us the way. I will teach you, we will learn from each other, and we will do the work together. Right. And so because of that, she gets forgotten, you know, she gets marginalized within her own movement. People are like, oh, yeah, Ella Baker. What? You're not here without her.
Right.
But I mean, again, this is like everybody, you know, all of the above was really my answer. But Ella Baker is just, there's no SNCC without her.
Yeah, definitely. And last question, if there's anything that I didn't mention or like I definitely would insert this. What's just one thing from the top of your head, like, oh, either this person or event should be mentioned through K through 12?
The Haitian Revolution.
Yes.
I think the Haitian Revolution. I think that we do not have a proper understanding of Haiti, that we only understand it through earthquakes and poverties and dictators and assassinations. That is not the Haiti that inspired the world in 1791 and again in 1803, and when they become official in 1804. The Haitian Revolution is the only revolution that emancipated its slaves. Therefore, the only revolution that was like a legit revolution, because you can't have a revolution without emancipation. You can't have a revolution and still have slavery. And that's what the United States did. You know, they still, I mean, the American Revolution is an incomplete revolution. Even the French Revolution is an incomplete revolution. But what Toussaint Louverture does, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Boukman, and Cécile Fatima, and all of these Haitian leaders that overthrew a European power and became an independent country in the Western Hemisphere, first Black independent country, I mean, boggles the mind. Like, there's a great quote by Frederick Douglass where he says, "The freedom that you and I enjoy today was bought by the sons and daughters of the Haitian Revolution." And I'm like, hashtag facts.
Yeah.
Hashtag facts. It's just incredible to think about what was accomplished there and the principles that were lived out by the people on the ground.
Definitely. And I think that it's important to mention that revolution and compare and contrast it to the American Revolution, because a lot of people have a distorted idea of the American Revolution and how slaves were emancipated. They weren't. Like they weren't. So they just weren't. And like it transferred over from one system to the other. So I think that's one thing that needs to be identified first. And then by comparing and contrasting it, you should say, now this is what it was supposed to look like.
Yeah.
And then we can start theorizing and saying, if it ended up like this, then this is probably the system that we would have set into place right now.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a lot more progressive and proactive and
complete. It's a completer story, you know, like you just can't, like, I think we talk about the Louisiana Purchase as Thomas Jefferson as this great negotiator who scores a deal and doubles the size of the country. No, France was broke. Napoleon was broke. Why? Because of the Haitian Revolution, because he could not keep affording to fight. So he sold the territory. You know, I mean, that is not because people were being kind or moral. It's because people were broken by this small little island that was winning, that was beating them. We don't talk about that enough, and it's just unfortunate. I mean, not only that, we don't talk about the fact that like in the 19th century, Haiti had like the second highest quality of life. People were living well. There was huge campaigns in the 1830s to get African Americans to migrate to the island and like set up shop and have coffee plantations and all of this stuff. I mean, if you could get there, you could make a decent living for yourself. Now we can talk about the debt that France requires it to pay. We can talk about U.S. occupation in 1915. We can talk about like colonization and how all of that has a huge impact on the Haiti we know now. But the Haiti then was a beacon for the rest of the Atlantic world. You know, when Simon Bolivar has his revolution in South America, Haiti sends funds, Haiti sends soldiers, Haiti sends guns. Like the freedom that you see in South America is part and parcel because of Haiti.
Right. Exactly. And I feel like that if we mention this revolution right here, and we compare and contrast it to our own history, um, we have to mention our involvement in the colonization that happened over there and the reason why it is the way it is today. And not only for that, but for all the countries that we didn't mind our business with. Like, I think that should be American history right now.
My gosh, we talked about this in my podcast today about 1915. President Wilson invades, takes 6,000 troops into Mexico. And you're like, what are we doing in Mexico?
Right.
Leave the Mexicans alone.
No, not even business. What natural resources did you see over there?
Yeah, really.
So is that part right there.
Yeah, I just can't imagine. This happens in 1915 when the U.S. brings in troops to Haiti and they basically invade Haiti and take it over. They write a new constitution, the gall. Could you imagine like Canadians coming over to the US like, you know what, we're gonna rewrite this constitution. Right. Y'all don't know what y'all doing. Honestly, we'd be all like, although Canadians might have been doing us a favor, but but still it's mind-boggling that you would think that countries had the audacity to do that. But in the age of imperialism and colonialism, that was the order of the day.
Right. Most definitely. Oh man, I guess we all warmed up now. Yes. Oh man, so I actually wanted to touch on the title of the podcast that you helped run, because that was the first thing that caught my attention. But before we'll go ahead and give just a little spiel of the podcast itself.
Yes, is this for this day in esoteric political history or epidemics? For this day in esoteric political history. So I should say I got brought on as a host about a year into the podcast. So Jody Abergan and Nikki Himmer originally started the podcast, and it's intended, it's a really long, kind of ridiculous title, but it's fun. And it also is like very specific. We call it This Day for short. But what I love about the podcast is that we take things that are esoteric that you may not know or that may not have been taught in your textbooks per se, and we talk about what happened on this particular day. So each day that we drop an episode, it's this day in esoteric political history, March 16th, President Wilson sends 6,000 troops into Mexico. We talk about today. We also talked about, it will debut next week. It's the 30th anniversary of the death of Latasha Harlan. And we talk about, the LA riots and what happened and her life. And so for some of these episodes, they are very familiar for students of history, I think. If you're a history nerd like I am or a history buff, you're familiar with it. But if you don't know, it's a perfect way to dive in and get quick, albeit rigorous amounts of information within about 15 minutes. So we drop an episode every Sunday. What is it? Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday. And it's just great because we have a lot of loyal listeners who give us feedback, who give us ideas for the next episode. And I've just been having so much fun with it. I actually love saying this day in esoteric political history because it's just a mouthful, but it kind of does roll off your tongue. I think.
Yeah, that word esoteric definitely stood out to me because I was like, oh, esoteric. I was all like, now I know the surface level definition of that word, but let's go ahead and Google it. And it's pretty much the meaning of a specific topic that a certain amount of people know or a specific population of people know. And what was very funny to me is that when it comes to the topics that you guys cover, or planning on covering too, is it's starting to grow into sort of back pocket information now, and which is super exciting because the current events that's unfolded last year and the year before has sort of inspired people to really dive inside the books and look inside history and see, well, what did you guys really do? Wait, no, so this is wrong.
Yes.
And this piece is missing, this piece is over there. And now everyone this current like generation of youth, especially, and then even the older generation, has really buckled down in learning American history, true American history, and the atrocities that happened here and overseas that we're responsible for.
Globally.
Yes.
It's just so important that, to me, I feel like there's a hunger and a thirst now for history and an appreciation of history's utility. Because I think for so long, students who would either major in history, I used to be in the history department, now I'm in Africana studies, but I'm still a historian. And students would say to me like, oh, I hate history. I'm like, no, you don't. You are history. Right. but that's because we've been taught history is just dates and names and places. And 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And it just feels monotonous. And it feels like, how am I going to use this to balance my checkbook? Although nobody balances a checkbook now, but like, you know what I mean? Like, how is this going to serve me? How can I use this? And now I think people very clearly see the utility of history. Like, whoa, this is a roadmap. This is a guidebook. If we don't get this right, we are going to repeat it again and again and again. And, January 6th may feel unprecedented in the moment that it happened, but it can happen again. The Civil War may have felt unprecedented. That can happen again. Like, history gives us the tools to understand what happened. And how should we make sense of it? And how should we grapple with it? And what caused it? And what were the consequences? And who was involved? Who was left out? Who was silenced?
Right.
Those things, who's got the mic, right?
Right.
All of those things, they matter so much. The stakes are so high, which is why it doesn't surprise me that parents are losing their minds in town halls and fighting over textbooks and, burning books and banning books.
See, that's my next question.
Yeah, the stakes are high.
Right. So, of course, I'm about to mention CRT, critical race theory.
Of course.
I'm going to mention it. Like, I can't get my head wrapped around it. So, well, first off, I wanted to ask, where are you from? Where were you born and raised?
So I'm a nomad. I say that because I've moved a lot. But I was born in Detroit, Michigan. Shout out to Detroit. I moved like 3 months after I was born, but my grandparents were all in Michigan. All of my extended family was in Michigan. I was raised in Illinois, and then the last out suburbs of Chicago, and then like central Illinois, like Bloomington, Normal. And then my last 2 years of high school, we moved to Texas. My mom was a college professor. So she was at Illinois State, and then, she was at Loyola, and then Illinois State, Loyola Chicago, Illinois State, and then Texas A&M. So I did my last 2 years of high school in College Station, Texas, maybe about 70 miles outside of Houston. And there I moved I went to Howard for undergrad. So I was in DC. I did a semester at UC Berkeley and then grad school at Columbia. And then I married my husband. He was in the military. So we lived in North Dakota and New York. And then we moved to Spokane, Washington. And we moved so many times that by the time we moved into the house that we're in right now, we had celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary, and we had celebrated our 15th move together as a couple, which is crazy because we did not move every year. Some years had multiple moves, some moves like 3 or 4 years before the next move. But it's crazy.
Wow. I just wanted to get a sense of I was like, well, where is she from? Because once you get a sense of where people are from or where they got their education, things like that, you have sort of an inside knowledge of why that state is so hell-bent of keeping CRT out of education system. So
and Texas is one of those states.
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to put. Texas is one of those states, and I have half my family over in Texas, so they're in
Texas.
Dallas.
Okay, my parents are in Houston. And my sisters are in Houston. I have a sister in Dallas, so Prosper, right outside of Dallas. Okay. But that's wild. Yeah, Texas is wilding.
Yeah, I was all like, bro, this is how we feel, huh?
Tell me how you really feel.
Right.
Okay.
So okay. These are the true colors. It was there, but you didn't know the extent of how far they would go. Especially with this current day and age and them really pushing on like, well, how much will the rest of our country tolerate this?
Yeah.
And I'm just like very curious of like, well, who's calling these shots, and like who is like fighting against it, and we don't hear about them. Like we hear about all of the atrocities that's happening, or all of the bans and things like that. And I'm like, but what about like the organizations, or like the board members, or like the people who, you know, are on the ground and like said no but got hushed? Like,
yes, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that.
Who are those people? And I wanted to get like your insight, if you've ever like, seen it personally, or you know like of people.
I haven't seen it in Massachusetts, which is where I live now, which is a blue state. We're suburbs of Boston, but for the most part, our school district, thankfully, is pretty progressive. I'm proud about that. But I will say that a lot of this hand-wringing is not about COC at all. It's about the 2022 election. It's about the 2024 election. It is about getting people fired up and afraid to motivate them to vote. It's also about voter suppression. It's also about, you know, at the same time, which I think people weren't paying attention to. And I've had like 2 slides when I've given like talks about this. It's like, there's a map that has all of the states that are colored that have attempted like CRT bans, or have effectively banned it, or they tried to ban it and it failed. And then there's the map of like states that are like actively pursuing voter suppression, redrawing their like guidelines on voting and all that stuff. You could lay one map on top
Georgia.
of the other. Texas, okay? Yeah. Texas. Lay one map on top of the other. You're like, oh, the people pushing for voter suppression are the same people pushing against CRT. Like, you know, they're a part of, really, this is the mastermind of a think tank that basically was like, how can we get people riled up? Like, and use this as a political boogeyman to get people to lose their minds. What I think is really difficult to swallow about this is that some of this gets tossed out. Some of this is like, ugh, this is superficial. You know what I mean?
Right.
But in other ways, it's drastically being turned into legislative law, like the law in which they are policing, you know, teachers' syllabuses and curriculums and lesson plans. And but teachers don't have time for that. You know what I mean? Like, we're trying to get these kids to learn how to read. Exactly. These kids have already been behind 2 years
with minimal resources.
Yes.
So,
you know, en masse, in some cases. And like, you know, we don't have time for this. You know, there are third graders that are still trying to get the literacy they were supposed to get in the first grade because of this pandemic. So we don't have time for it. But then when I was listening to another podcast, and now I hate it because I can't give them a shout out. I can't remember the name of the podcast, but it was a librarian who was saying that like she was going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that no books were ever banned, that no books were ever thrown out or anything like that. And when she used to even put up a display of like banned books proudly in the library so students could check it out. And she was always invested in giving books so that students could see themselves, whether it be Black students or LGBTQ students. Like, I want you to see yourself. Here's the book you might like, right? And when she started to come under fire and the community started to threaten her job, she wound up leaving her job. And she basically said, like, I can't do the work I want to do anymore. Like, I feel afraid for my life. I feel afraid for my livelihood. And it just shows you how difficult it is to do the right thing. We think doing the right thing is so easy. It is not in the face of a mob, right? You know, not in the face of a shouting match. You know, it's like, hey, just take me out. I'd rather lose. I forfeit, you know, than give up, you know, the things that you're trying to take from me. So it's really, really troubling. I would say that we are in crisis mode when it comes to our educational system. And it's funny, you know, I used to joke, it's not funny, but I used to joke with my husband that like, because, you know, they're like jobs like doctors that save lives or, you know, whatever. And I'm like, I'm saving lives. And he's like, you're a historian. And I was like, I know, the stakes are high.
Yeah.
Like,
they are.
Like, okay, but you know, I feel that. I really feel like the implications for what it means to not have, one, to not have access to the ballot. Right. Two, to not have the very education you would need to inform how you would vote on a ballot.
Right.
Like,
right.
Is connected. It is connected. Mm-hmm. So you rob people of information. You rob people of the ability to get an education that will make them balanced and complete. And then you rob them of being, you know, responsible citizens. These are hard times.
Right. Right. And it's being robbed inside targeted communities as well. Yeah, because I'm not sure about your slides and things like that, but if you look closely, like where voter suppression is happening, and then also where CRT is putting into place, it's prevalent that these are people who are people of color.
Yeah, and it's a simultaneous attack. It's a two-front attack. You know what I mean? It's an attack from the bottom, it's an attack from the top.
Right.
To keep people from, I mean, when you make laws that say you can't give people bottles of water while they stand in line. Right. Are we a democracy or are we a democracy? Do you know what I mean? Like, there shouldn't be no law that exists on the books in the United States that says that. It makes all of this a farce. So, you know, it's very troubling, because how do we undo that? How do we undo it? And I don't mean undo it for the next 4 years or for the next election. How do we undo all of that harm? You can't just walk that back.
Right. And if you look back in history, like this sort of oppression and this sort of, you know, gatekeeping and like making sure that certain people keep the power has started from the beginning. So, and it's hard to, and I want to ask your perspective on this as well. It's hard to address that for people who don't already have that knowledge, whether they come from a background of higher education or just a background that's not a person of color, and you have the privilege of not learning about it because your life wasn't at stake for it. So there's a certain level of knowledge and, you know, information that people of color have, whether you're Black or, you know, Latino or Latina or Asian or things like that, that you keep in your back pocket, compared to if you identify as white, because you don't have that privilege not to know it. It's very, very hard to explain. And I've tried to explain it to other people too, but like, have you ever been faced with that sort of issue? And how have you addressed it as a historian? Encourage like people either around you, your peers, or even like higher up, like people who are in charge of making like, you know, decisions, like, hey, like, because your board is all white, this is why we're at this problem.
This is why we are where we are. Yeah, man, there is, I wish I could pull it up. There's actually I can pull it up, hold on. It's a quote that I use from, hold on, I'm gonna pull this up and see if I can get it so I can have the exact quote. I won't have any of your listeners saying, oh, she making up stuff. I will not be caught in a lie. But it is a great King quote that just perfectly summarizes everything you just said. And I have it right. Where is it? Here it is. Okay, it's just opening up. But anyways, I'll set it up. I'll set the quote up. So Martin Luther King is giving a speech, and he's talking about basically the real problem in American society is not like the Klan, it is like white liberals. And he goes on to talk about, why is this not opening? Hold on 1 second. I don't have my let me move my, we can cut all this in post-production. Hold on.
Oh, you're all good. Yeah.
See if I can get this to open up. How is it not opening? Uh-huh. Okay, here's the quote. Okay, so this is what he says. Okay. He says, whites, it must be frankly said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that white people of America believe they have so little to learn. The reality of substantial investment to assist Negroes into the 20th century, adjusting to Negro neighbors, and genuine school integration is still a nightmare for too many white Americans. And I'm like, wow.
Yes.
Wow. Spot on. Like, there's so much about that quote where he's like, they have to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance, but you can't do that because they believe they're better than you, and because they believe they're better than you, they believe they have so little to learn. Yes. You have so little you could offer them as a way of moving their own lives forward. I mean, it's so problematic, but that is how a lot of white people feel in this country. They feel like, no, racism's your problem. It's not my problem. This is what you did. You know what I mean? Like, you're just not working hard enough. You just won't be American, you know? And of course, nothing could be further from the truth, but like, that is the problem, which in a lot of times, you know, people get baffled when I say this, but I'm like, racism is not my problem. Okay.
Right.
It's, you did this.
Your ignorance is not
white
my
people,
problem.
You created this system. You created the slavery, the Jim Crow, the segregation, the redlining, the mass incarceration, the profiling, the police brutality, the segregate. Like, you created Jim Crow. So I'm not the issue here, but white people have also created spaces for them that have isolated them so much from people that are different from them. They go to all white schools. They live in all white neighborhoods. They go to all white churches. They go on vacation with all white people. You know what I mean? Or they go on vacation where there's all black people, like in the Caribbean, but they're only in service to them or only in subordination to them. They don't see black people as their bosses or their managers or their CEOs. And so they have such a difficult time navigating around an authority that does not look like them, navigating around intelligence that does not look like them, that it's really, really hard to counter these ideas when you ain't got no black friends.
Right.
And I'm talking about real friends that have been over your house, that eat your food, that know who you are, you've been to their house, you know what I mean? They don't have those meaningful interactions. And that's a huge barrier to getting white people to understand what it is that they need to know, because they're like, my life is fine.
Right. And I love that you pointed out that point, that it's a active sort of isolation. And sometimes it's conscious and like unconscious decision that white Americans and even just Europeans have done time and time again. Like, if we take CRT, for example, the option to opt out your child of critical race theory during Black during Black History Month. They don't have to learn about Black history. That's not their history. But we can't opt out of learning about Thomas Jefferson when he owned.
And this is the real rub. Like, the real rub for me was when white families were like, CRT harms my children. My child is going to be harmed. I was like, you know what's harmed? When Kenneth Clark does a black doll test and black children are saying, like, the white doll is the pretty doll. The white doll is the smart doll. Like, the black doll's the bad doll. The black doll's the ugly doll. Like, that study was used in the Supreme Court case for Brown v. Board of Education to talk about the psychological harm that was caused to black children. You want to talk about harm to black children? Let's talk about the bombing of a church and 4 little girls being killed in a house of worship. Let's talk about Emmett Till, who's 14 years old, or Tamir Rice, right? Like, black children are being killed. Black children don't get to be children.
Right.
So I don't want to hear about Tommy crying. I don't want to hear about Katie's nightmares. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to hear about Becky feeling bad.
Right.
Because, like, This is harmful and violent. Racism is violent in its core, in its pure essence. It is violent. And it has no respecter of persons. You can be elderly, you womb to tomb, right? Racism is coming for Black people. And it is not coming for white people in the same way. Right. They have no costs, no penalties, no fears, not real ones. So, you know, I mean, I get really upset about this because I have small children and my kids are young, but there will come a point in time when they will come into understanding of what it means to occupy a Black body, a brown body. And there's real consequences for them that white children will never have to think about. And that makes me mad. And it makes me sad.
Right. Because it's completely unfair that the essence of their childhood is robbed from the very beginning. Yeah. And especially if you have a little boy too at this day and age, and us worrying about police brutality, and you have to sit down with that little boy and give him a discussion. And girl. And like, there's no discrimination. Children. Right? Just children, just little Black boys and children everywhere. When it comes to that, you have to sit them down and explain to them, because of the color of their skin, that there could be consequences, because there's people out there that don't have your best interest at heart. Or really out to get you. And my main argument, I get super upset when people, you know, mention that. But my main argument is like, well, you know, if you're so upset about like CRT or, you know, the harm that is going to affect for white children, then how about you expose that harm to them and then teach them about allyship? Yeah. Like, I don't understand. Like, there's no, the idea of rehabilitation and actually helping out when it comes to a cause that's so much bigger than you and your family didn't even cross your mind. You were so clouded by your white fragility that you didn't think about progressive ideas that can actually help uplift this community that you support, because you put a Black Lives Matter sign in front of your house. So even though you live inside Beverly Grove in California. So, you
know, one of my brilliant colleagues, Jen Chudy, is a political scientist at Wellesley College. And she did a study that was in the New York Times. And it was 1 year after George Floyd's murder. And they found that at the time of George Floyd's murder, 1 in 5 white people felt bad about discrimination. They felt bad about the experiences that Black people were living through. And so when they did the study a year later, to be like, do they still feel bad? 1 in 10. Wow. 1 in 10. 1 in 5 to 1 in 10. A year later, even less people were empathetic toward the discrimination that Black people experienced, because it was like, didn't children go to jail? Are we over this? You know, like, people were not, they were not invested beyond that moment, beyond that period. And even in that moment, you only got 1 out of 5. You know what I mean? So it wasn't like you got like 2 out of 4 people are upset.
Right. That's not even
4 out of 5 people are upset, you know? So what do you do with those statistics? But I think equally important is, what do you do with the 10% of the white people that do feel empathy, that do want to move beyond empathy and turn that into action? Who are they? Why are they? How do they exist? You know what I mean? And like, how do we engage them and equip them to continue in this struggle? One of the things she found in her study was that the 1 out of 10 people, that 10th person, if you will, there's no prototype. Meaning they're men, they're women, they're educated, they're uneducated, they're rural, they're urban, they're young, they're old, they're parents, they're single. You know, like, there's no through line to say like, oh, well, white urban people are going to be much more sympathetic than white rural people. No, right? Like, or, you know, college educated people are going to be more sympathetic than high school degrees. No, like, they can't explain why they feel the empathy that they do. So it means that we have to teach for the whole class, right? You can't just try to find that one person that you think is going to be sympathetic, that one liberal sticker button person. It is, you have to teach to the whole class. And so, because you never know when it's going to click for someone.
Right.
And that's why this work is hard and it's long and it's exhausting. But, you know, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. So, exactly. You know, that's where we are right now.
Well, I wanted to even expand on that because I just saw, it was just a post on social media, and it was this young Black woman was actually very upset because she saw like, there are no white allies. Like, can you think of one white ally throughout history that had their best interests at heart, that did not have something in it for them? And I was like, I'm pretty sure that there are some. I can't think of lots. Yeah, no?
I can think of lots. I can think of lots.
Yes. I was not like, there was this one person, I could not think of his name, but there was one person, I was all like, well, I'm gonna just settle for Betty White. I was like, there you go. I was like, you can't lose with Betty White. So I was like, game over.
Oh man, you know, I will say that is hilarious, first of all. I mean, one of the people I always reference, and this is because they're in my book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Check it out. Shameless plug, but it's not shameless, actually, like plug. But in Force and Freedom, I talk about John Brown, and I talk about how John Brown was this radical white abolitionist who understood whiteness and white supremacy and anti-Blackness so clearly. I look at him almost as like this, you know, this like prophet without a home, this person who's out in the wilderness, like telling people, listen, this is bad. This is real bad. And then he basically says, okay, so you don't want to listen? All right, well, I'm just about to start freeing Black people. Let's rally the troops. Let's get guns, right? Let's have this raid. Let's go to Harper's Ferry. Harry, you want in? Freddie Doug, you want in? Like, he's gathering all the Black people. He's reading Toussaint Louverture's biography. You know, he's also influenced by the Haitian Revolution. This is how I know. I was like, oh, my man has done his research. John Brown knows. This starts with Haiti. And like, he basically, you know, he forfeits his life in a way. I mean, this was a suicide mission. And he starts this raid. It only lasts about 2 or 3 days before, you know, US troops come in and shut it all down. And then he's lynched, or as a result of that, he's hung. But you know, his final words were like, listen, the end of the Negro question, we are not there yet. We have not solved this. And America, like, you have got to deal with he didn't say white supremacy, but that's essentially what he's saying. But I think that, you know, James Baldwin probably said it best. He said, to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to put yourself in danger. And I think that when we really start to think about these ideas, these hard ideas of forfeiture and the relinquishment of power, you gotta really think about how committed you want to be to that. And then when you commit yourself to that, to put yourself in danger doesn't mean you're going to get assassinated, but it does mean you might lose some friends. You might not get some promotions. You might not have the kind of wealth that you want to accumulate. You know, you have to, that this work should cost you something. If done right, it should cost you something. And most people prefer to live comfortable lives, you know? And the only problem with that is that we're not going to get free operating from that framework.
Exactly.
I have to go at 5 though, but can we do one more question though before I have to get to
Definitely. No. We're actually like, we're done because it's like an hour, but this has been a lovely discussion.
Do you want to ask? Do you want to do a follow, like one more final anything?
Yes. Actually, I just wanted to give the opportunity of like any plugins that you have, or any, like, if you want to advertise your book or like your podcast or anything like that. And then like we would love to have you again. Obviously.
Oh my gosh! First of all, I would totally come back. You are so much fun. This flew by. I mean, like, the conversation is just so great. I love love talking to people who are passionate about this work. So thank you so much for having me, first of all. And right now, Force and Freedom was my first book. It came out in 2019. The paperback came out a couple years ago, but it's still selling really, really well. It's still being put on syllabuses. I'm really proud of it. It won a number of awards. It got shortlisted for a lot of prizes. The Washington Post put it on one of their lists for top books to read on African American history. So I'm really proud of Force and Freedom. I stand by that book. And I think for people who want to know more about like the ideas of force and violence and protests and social movements, it's a good place to start. The second thing I'm working on is Operdemics. I realized that like, as much as I'm into the study of force and violence, I need something fun. Yeah. And for me, this new podcast has been such a balm for me. I mean, I grew up watching Oprah. I love the Oprah Winfrey Show, and I get to have these awesome conversations with my good friend Leah Wright Rigueur, and we bring on all these great guests, journalists, comedians, other academics. That's why we're called Operdemics, two academics talking about all things Oprah. But we just go back in the vault and we're like, remember this episode? Remember that episode? And it's a great way to sort of relive moments that we might have been familiar with. But also for those who don't really know Oprah or never had a chance to like watch her show, because it did go off in 2011. This is a way they get reintroduced to her and understand why she's like the queen of talk. So it's Operdemics, the study of the Queen of Talk, and that debuts on Radiotopia at the end of this month. So yeah, and then I got other book projects in the works, but they won't be out for a while. So when they come out, I will come back. And I will plug them.
Please plug them, and we will be more than happy to advertise these on all of our social media platforms. If there's any like images, like specific images that you would love to insert, we would love to support you.
I will do that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Definitely. This was great, Christian. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Well, hopefully we'll get back to you again and have you for another episode. But you have a lovely evening over there.
Yes, I know. It's about 5 o'clock. Yeah. The sun is finally coming down. So that's perfect.
Evening, and hopefully we hear from you soon.
Sounds good.